The convoy appeared through clouds of choking dust that May afternoon in 1943. Red Texas dirt swirled behind the military trucks like a storm. Inside those canvas-covered vehicles sat dozens of German soldiers. Their faces showed exhaustion. Their uniforms were stained with sweat and grime. These men had fought under Rommel in the scorching North African desert just weeks before. Now they found themselves prisoners. They were being transported to a destination none of them could have imagined before this war began. The trucks slowed as they approached the outskirts of Hurn, Texas. Through gaps in the canvas, the prisoners caught their first glimpses of American soil. What they saw contradicted everything their commanders had told them about this country. For years, Nazi propaganda had filled their heads with terrible stories about American cruelty. They had been warned that Americans showed no mercy to captured soldiers. Many genuinely believed they were riding toward their own execution. The landscape outside looked alien to European eyes. Endless flat plains stretched in every direction. Strange mechanical pumps dotted the horizon like metal insects. The heat was suffocating. Their wool uniforms clung to their skin. One prisoner would later remember thinking this barren place looked like the surface of another world entirely. But when the trucks finally stopped, there were no firing squads waiting. Instead, they saw orderly rows of wooden barracks surrounded by standard barbed wire fencing. Camp Hurn stretched across the Texas countryside against a backdrop of cotton fields. This facility was just one small piece in an enormous operation that would transform Texas into the largest POW host state in America. The numbers tell an extraordinary story of wartime logistics. Texas eventually operated more than 50 POW camps, housing over 50,000 German and Italian prisoners. Across the entire United States, approximately 380,000 German POWs would spend years on American soil. The government chose Texas for strategic reasons. The state offered vast open spaces perfect for secure facilities. Existing military installations could be quickly expanded. Most importantly, Texas farms desperately needed workers as American men shipped overseas to fight. When those truck tailgates finally dropped at Camp Hurn, the German prisoners stepped into their new reality with tremendous fear. They expected torture. They expected brutality. They expected the savage treatment their officers had promised they would receive. Instead, they encountered something that would fundamentally challenge everything they thought they knew about Americans. The guards watching them weren't the Hollywood soldiers they had imagined. Many were local Texans doing their military service close to home. These men were too old for combat duty overseas. Others possessed agricultural expertise the government deemed too valuable to send abroad. They wore army uniforms, certainly, but they also wore weathered cowboy boots that had seen more ranch work than parade grounds. They carried themselves with a distinctly Western confidence that seemed completely unmilitary to German eyes trained on rigid Prussian discipline. Their drawling voices and relaxed manner seemed utterly foreign to prisoners expecting harsh military protocol. The camp itself resembled a small temporary city, more than a prison. Wooden frame buildings were arranged in neat, orderly rows. Guard towers stood at the corners with searchlights ready for nighttime duty. The overall atmosphere wasn't the brutal concentration camp environment the prisoners had feared. The barracks contained actual beds, not concrete floors or straw mats. A proper mess hall served meals. Recreation areas provided space for exercise and socializing. Even designated areas existed for sports activities. Geneva Convention requirements were being followed to the letter. This would become increasingly apparent as the days unfolded, and the prisoners realized they weren't going to be murdered or tortured. May 1943 marked the beginning of an extraordinary chapter that most Americans have never heard about. Those dusty convoys carried men who had surrendered to Allied forces in Tunisia after the collapse of German resistance in North Africa. They had been shipped across the Atlantic Ocean in cramped transport vessels. Now they found themselves being processed at facilities scattered across the American heartland. The landscape seemed utterly foreign to men who had grown up in European villages and cities. The flat Texas plains stretched endlessly in every direction. Oil derricks pumped rhythmically in the distance like mechanical heartbeats. The oppressive heat made their heavy wool uniforms unbearable. Nothing resembled the Europe they had left behind. The prisoners arriving at Camp Hurn, located roughly 90 miles north of Houston, had been thoroughly conditioned by Nazi propaganda to expect the worst possible treatment. For years, German soldiers had been told that Americans were savage, lawless people who showed no mercy to captured enemies. Some prisoners genuinely believed during that truck ride that they were being transported to execution sites. Heinrich Mattei, a former POW who later wrote extensively about his experience, recalled making peace with death during the journey. He was convinced the Americans would shoot all the prisoners and claim they had tried to escape. The tension inside those transport vehicles was suffocating. Young men barely out of their teens sat shoulder to shoulder with hardened combat veterans. All of them wondered if they would live to see another sunrise. Fear hung in the air like smoke. Some prayed silently. Others stared blankly ahead, trying to prepare for whatever awaited them. But what they found completely defied every expectation their superiors had planted in their minds. Camp Hurn was just one installation in a vast network that would eventually make Texas the premier POW destination in America. By the war's end, Texas operated more POW camps than any other state. The facilities held more than 50,000 Axis prisoners from multiple countries. Nationwide, the United States detained an estimated 380,000 German POWs on American soil. This staggering number required massive infrastructure development. The government selected Texas for several practical reasons. The state possessed vast, uninhabited land perfect for building secure facilities quickly. Existing military bases could be rapidly expanded to accommodate thousands of prisoners. Perhaps most importantly, Texas faced a critical shortage of agricultural workers as American men deployed to fight overseas. The prisoners would provide essential labor for farms and ranches struggling to maintain production. When the trucks finally stopped and prisoners climbed down at Camp Hurn, they found themselves facing a reality that contradicted their worst fears. Rows of wooden barracks stretched across the facility in orderly grids. Standard barbed wire fencing surrounded the compound. Guard towers occupied each corner with searchlights and armed sentries. The facility was designed to house up to 4,800 prisoners, according to Geneva Convention specifications. This wasn't the torture camp they had expected. The structures were simple, but solid construction. Real beds filled the barracks' interiors. Mess facilities were clean and functional. Designated recreation areas provided space for prisoners to exercise and socialize. The guards observing their arrival weren't what the prisoners had anticipated either. Many were middle-aged Texans with deep connections to ranching and farming. These men had been classified too old for combat duty overseas. Others possessed agricultural skills the government couldn't afford to lose from domestic food production. They stood there wearing army uniforms, certainly, but they also wore scuffed boots that showed more ranch work than military service. They carried themselves with a relaxed confidence that seemed distinctly unmilitary to German prisoners trained on rigid discipline. Their casual manner and Western swagger had nothing to do with standard military protocol. The first several days at Camp Hurn operated on mutual suspicion and careful observation. The German prisoners kept strictly to themselves, organizing along traditional military lines as their officers maintained discipline within the compound under Geneva Convention rules. The American guards watched carefully for any signs of trouble or potential escape attempts. Both sides circled each other warily like two groups of strange dogs. They were men who had been taught to see each other as mortal enemies. Now they were separated only by chain-link fencing and a few yards of Texas dirt. The barriers seemed both physical and psychological. Neither group knew quite what to expect from extended contact. Then something completely unexpected happened during an evening in late May 1943. The moment would later be remembered as the beginning of an extraordinary transformation that nobody could have predicted. A group of off-duty guards sat outside the wire after finishing their shift. They had propped up their boots and were enjoying the cooling air after another scorching day. The temperature finally dropped from unbearable to merely uncomfortable. One of them, a local rancher named Jim Crawford from nearby Robertson County, pulled out a pack of Lucky Strikes and lit up a cigarette. Several German prisoners stood near the fence, watching with barely concealed longing. Anyone who has experienced combat understands that cigarettes become currency, comfort, and sanity, all rolled into paper and tobacco. These men hadn't enjoyed a decent smoke in many weeks. Their eyes followed every movement as Crawford inhaled. Crawford noticed their intense stares. For a long moment, nobody moved or spoke. The evening air hung still and heavy. Then Crawford stood up slowly, walked directly to the fence, and held out his cigarette pack. "You boys smoke?" he asked in his thick Texas drawl. The question hung in the air like a challenge. The Germans hesitated, uncertain how to respond. Was this some kind of test or trick? Was it a trap designed to get them in trouble? But Crawford just shook the pack insistently, waiting for someone to respond. One prisoner, a former clerk from Hamburg named Otto Fischer, finally stepped forward cautiously and accepted a cigarette through the wire. Crawford struck a match and held it steady while Fischer lit up. Then another prisoner approached hesitantly. Soon another followed. Within minutes, half a dozen Germans stood at the fence, smoking American cigarettes alongside American guards. Nobody was quite sure how this interaction had happened, but nobody wanted to break the spell that seemed to have settled over the scene. The shared moment felt significant, though none of them could have explained exactly why. That small gesture cracked something open between the two groups. Over the following weeks, these informal evening gatherings became a regular routine. Guards finishing their shifts would often spend time near the fence after duty hours. Prisoners naturally gravitated to those same spots. They couldn't communicate much at first, since most guards spoke only English, while most prisoners knew only German. But they managed effectively with hand gestures, a few shared words, and pointing. Eventually, the handful of German-speaking guards and English-speaking prisoners began serving as impromptu translators. Communication slowly improved, as both sides picked up phrases from each other's languages. What the prisoners discovered in these conversations shocked them more than any battlefield experience. These American cowboys weren't the brutal, uncultured monsters their propaganda machine had described for years. They were farmers genuinely worried about their crops back home. They were fathers who proudly showed photographs of their children. They were men who had grown up breaking wild horses and mending ranch fences. They loved their land with a deep passion the Germans could recognize because many prisoners came from farming families themselves. The connection was immediate and unmistakable. One guard, Bill Kraus, had German grandparents who had immigrated to Texas in the 1880s. When he spoke a few halting phrases of German learned from his grandmother years earlier, the prisoners nearly fell over in complete surprise. The cigarette sharing became symbolic of something much larger than tobacco. Under the Geneva Convention, the United States was required to provide POWs with rations comparable to American soldiers, including regular tobacco products. But there's a profound difference between receiving your official cigarette ration through formal military channels and having a cowboy offer you one of his personal Lucky Strikes. There's a difference between a bureaucratic distribution and a human gesture. The difference between striking a match like two ranch hands taking a break rather than captor and captive sharing a moment. That difference mattered immensely to men starved for normal human interaction. Within weeks of their arrival, the German prisoners at Camp Hurn and similar facilities across Texas had settled into daily routines that bore little resemblance to the hardships they had endured on various battlefields. The United States military had established a comprehensive system designed to keep POWs occupied, productive, and compliant with international law. Every morning began with roll call at dawn, prisoners standing in neat formation while guards counted heads and checked for any overnight incidents or problems. After breakfast in the mess hall, meals that frequently included eggs, bacon, bread, and real coffee, the structured workday officially began. The labor program became the absolute backbone of daily life for most prisoners. Texas desperately needed workers for its crucial agricultural sector, and the POWs provided an ideal solution to wartime labor shortages. Under Geneva Convention rules, enlisted prisoners could be required to work for modest wages. Officers, however, could not be compelled to perform labor. Most of the Germans at Camp Hurn were enlisted men from various backgrounds. They were assigned to work in the surrounding cotton fields, onion farms, and vegetable crops. The pay was nominal by American standards, roughly 80 cents per day in special script currency that could only be spent at the camp canteen. But this gave prisoners actual purchasing power for cigarettes, toiletries, and small luxuries that made captivity significantly more bearable. The work itself was genuinely hard, especially during cotton-picking season when the brutal Texas heat regularly climbed above 100 degrees. The sun was merciless. The humidity was suffocating. The cotton plants seemed to stretch endlessly. But here's what astonished many of the prisoners beyond all expectations. They found themselves working alongside civilian supervisors who treated them like regular farm hands rather than enemy combatants or dangerous prisoners. A local farmer named Ernest Langford, who supervised German work crews on his property outside Hurn, later recalled in interviews that the POWs were often superior workers compared to the local help he'd employed before the war started. They understood farming, he said, in a 1980s interview preserved in local historical archives. A lot of them came from agricultural backgrounds back in Germany. They knew crops, understood livestock behavior, knew proper techniques. We'd show them what needed doing, and they'd do it right the first time, Langford continued. No complaining, no shortcuts, no excuses. Just solid, dependable work from men who knew what they were doing. The food situation exceeded anything the prisoners had experienced during years of wartime rationing in Europe. While German civilians were literally starving under Allied blockades, and soldiers at the front subsisted on increasingly meager rations, the POWs in Texas consumed approximately 3,500 calories per day. This was exactly the same nutritional standard provided to American troops. Breakfast might include hot oatmeal, scrambled eggs, and buttered toast. Lunch often featured substantial sandwiches, hearty soup, and fresh fruit when available. Dinner could consist of pork chops, mashed potatoes, cooked vegetables, and fresh bread, with occasional desserts like pie or cake. The abundance was almost overwhelming for men accustomed to hunger. Former prisoner Hans Lammersdorf wrote extensively in his personal diary, which was carefully preserved and later donated to the Camp Hurn Historical Preservation Society for their archives. He noted that he gained 23 pounds during his first 4 months of captivity. "I eat better as a prisoner in Texas than I did as a free man in Hamburg during the last 2 years of supposed peace," he wrote in an entry dated August 1943. The camp maintained recreational facilities that would have been completely unthinkable on the Russian front or in the African desert campaigns. Prisoners organized competitive soccer teams that played spirited matches on a designated field. They formed musical groups since several camps housed prisoners who had been professional musicians before military conscription. These groups gave regular concerts that both prisoners and guards attended with genuine enthusiasm. Camp Hurn maintained a well-stocked library filled with German language books, though all materials were carefully screened for Nazi propaganda content. The Red Cross provided art supplies, and many prisoners spent their evening hours painting landscapes or sketching portraits. There was even a camp newspaper, carefully censored by authorities, but still providing an outlet for creative expression and communication. Religious services were permitted under strict Geneva Convention requirements. Catholic and Protestant chaplains visited the facility regularly to conduct services. The prisoners constructed small but meaningful chapels within the compound boundaries. For men who had spent years surrounded by death and destruction, these quiet Sunday services provided psychological relief that would be difficult to overstate. As the summer of 1943 gradually turned to fall, something truly remarkable began happening at Camp Hurn after the official workday ended each evening. The guards had discovered through experience that their most peaceful and manageable shifts were the ones where they actively engaged with the prisoners rather than simply watching them from a suspicious distance. Evening hours became the time when the barriers between captor and captive grew thinnest and most permeable. Nowhere was this transformation more evident than around the improvised gathering spots that came to resemble traditional campfires in spirit, though actual fires were strictly prohibited for obvious security reasons. These gatherings started completely organically, without any official planning or encouragement. After dinner, when the prisoners enjoyed free time before the mandatory lights out at 10 o'clock, groups would naturally congregate in the designated recreation yard areas. Guards who had finished their tower duty or completed perimeter patrols would sometimes linger nearby instead of immediately returning to quarters. Conversations would spark up seemingly by accident, then continue naturally. The language barrier slowly but steadily crumbled, as both sides made genuine efforts to pick up basic phrases from each other's tongues. Germans eagerly learned distinctly American words like howdy, reckon, and the ubiquitous y'all. The Texans acquired basic German greetings and frequently attempted longer sentences with results that were so badly butchered they left the prisoners laughing until tears came to their eyes. Music became the truly universal language that needed absolutely no translation between cultures. The German prisoners possessed a rich centuries-old tradition of folk songs dating back to medieval times and beyond. On warm evenings, you could hear them singing Lily Marleen, the haunting ballad that had somehow become beloved by soldiers on both sides of this terrible war. The song told the timeless story of a soldier saying goodbye to his sweetheart under a lamppost before marching off to an uncertain fate. When the Germans sang this song with their harmonious voices blending in the Texas twilight, even the guards who couldn't understand a single word of German could feel the deep longing and sadness woven into the melody. One guard, Tommy Aldridge from Waco, later recalled decades afterward, "You didn't need to speak German to know those boys were singing about missing home and the people they loved. Same feelings we all had, just in different words." The Texans naturally reciprocated with their own rich musical heritage passed down through generations. Cowboys who had grown up singing to calm cattle during long night watches pulled out harmonicas and guitars to perform traditional Western ballads. Songs like Red River Valley and Streets of Laredo filled the evening air. These songs told classic stories of the American frontier: lonesome cowboys riding endless ranges, grueling cattle drives across vast distances, lost loves left behind in distant towns. The Germans sat completely transfixed, hearing an entirely different musical tradition that nonetheless spoke to universal human themes they could recognize immediately. Some prisoners later said that hearing those authentic cowboy songs was their first real glimpse into American culture, beyond the distorted caricatures Nazi propaganda had fed them for years. The storytelling tradition extended far beyond music into spoken narratives that captivated both audiences. The cowboy guards absolutely loved sharing detailed tales of their ranching lives, and they had discovered a genuinely captive audience who had never encountered anything remotely like Western American culture. One guard, Bobby Hendricks, would describe bronco-busting competitions at the local rodeo with vivid enthusiasm. The way a wild Mustang would explode violently from the chute like a four-legged thunderbolt. The sacred 8-second rule that separated men from boys. The broken bones and brief moments of glory that came with successfully staying mounted on 1,500 pounds of furious, bucking horseflesh. The Germans listened with absolute fascination, asking detailed questions through their patient interpreters. How exactly do you train a wild horse? What's the practical difference between a Mustang and a quarter horse? Is it really true that cowboys sleep under the open stars during cattle drives? These questions revealed genuine curiosity about a completely foreign way of life. The prisoners had their own fascinating stories to share from their former lives in Germany. Many came from rural German communities with their own deeply rooted folk traditions stretching back centuries. They talked enthusiastically about harvest festivals in Bavaria with detailed descriptions of ancient customs. They described brewing beer using secret family recipes passed down through multiple generations. They spoke of hunting expeditions in the mysterious Black Forest. A prisoner named Wolfgang Heller, who had worked as a village schoolteacher before military conscription interrupted his peaceful life, described the famous Christmas markets in Nuremberg with such vivid, sensory detail that the listening guards could almost smell the roasted almonds and taste the steaming mulled wine. These weren't stories about warfare, politics, or military strategy. They were precious glimpses into normal, everyday lives that had been violently interrupted by historical forces completely beyond any individual's control or choice. By the spring of 1944, some of the guards at Camp Hurn began taking this remarkable cultural exchange to an entirely new and unprecedented level. Several of the cowboy guards came from working ranches where they had spent their entire lives mastering skills that truly defined Texas identity. Roping, riding, cattle handling, horse training, these were arts passed down from father to son across generations. They started noticing that some of the German prisoners watched with intense, almost hungry curiosity whenever horses were brought near the camp for routine maintenance work or supply deliveries. A few enterprising guards decided, with the camp commander's cautious approval, to begin teaching willing prisoners some basic Western horsemanship skills during carefully supervised recreation periods. The experiment started slowly and carefully. The first lessons were deliberately simple and completely controlled for security reasons. Guards brought in older, gentle horses that wouldn't spook easily or pose danger to inexperienced handlers. They demonstrated the proper way to approach a horse safely, how to read its body language for signs of fear or aggression, exactly where to stand to avoid getting kicked by powerful hind legs. For many of the German prisoners, this represented their first opportunity to be this close to horses outside of military cavalry units, where the animals were viewed purely as equipment rather than living beings with personalities. A prisoner named Karl Mueller, a baker's son from Stuttgart, later wrote that the simple act of touching a horse's soft muzzle and feeling its warm breath on his outstretched hand was the first moment in over 2 years that he had felt genuinely peaceful. The cowboy instructors started with basic groundwork, patiently teaching the Germans how to properly hold a lariat rope, explaining the physics involved in throwing an effective loop. Ranch hand Jake Morrison demonstrated the fundamental swing technique, the way you build momentum with the rope circling rhythmically above your head before releasing it toward the intended target. The timing had to be absolutely perfect, or the loop would collapse uselessly. The first attempts by the eager prisoners were comically unsuccessful. Ropes tangled into knots. Loops collapsed before reaching their targets. More than one German nearly managed to lasso himself instead of the practice post, creating hilarious scenes that had everyone laughing. But the guards proved to be remarkably patient teachers, breaking down each complex movement into manageable steps, carefully correcting grip and stance the same way they would teach their own sons back on the family ranch. Something completely unexpected emerged from these patient lessons. Several of the German prisoners displayed genuinely natural talent for the demanding work that surprised everyone involved, including themselves. A former farmhand named Ernst Fröhlich from the Rhineland region took to roping with absolutely remarkable speed and precision. Within just 3 weeks of consistent practice, he could reliably lasso a stationary target from 15 feet away. The guards were genuinely impressed with his progress. Fröhlich possessed the crucial hand-eye coordination and infinite patience that separates merely competent ropers from truly skilled practitioners of the art. "That boy's got the natural touch," guard Charlie Patterson remarked admiringly to his colleagues after watching Fröhlich's steady improvement. "Give him a full year on a proper ranch, and he'd hold his own at any rodeo in Texas." The riding lessons required even greater trust between guards and prisoners than the roping instruction. Allowing POWs onto horseback presented obvious and serious security concerns that couldn't be ignored by camp administrators. But the camp leadership recognized that the riding activity provided enormous morale benefits for prisoners while keeping them productively occupied during free time hours. The Germans who were permitted to participate in the experimental riding program were very carefully vetted. They were mostly older, more mature prisoners who had demonstrated no interest whatsoever in escape attempts and had developed genuinely friendly relationships with multiple guards over many months of interaction. The instruction began with absolute basics: proper mounting and dismounting techniques, learning how to sit correctly in a Western saddle, how to hold the leather reins properly, how to use subtle leg pressure to communicate commands to the horse. One prisoner, Joseph Kramer, who had worked extensively with heavy draft horses on his family's farm in rural Bavaria, proved to be an exceptionally quick learner who adapted rapidly to Western riding styles. The fundamental skill set transferred beautifully from his previous experience. He understood instinctive horse behavior, knew how to remain calm and confident in the saddle, and possessed the gentle firmness that horses invariably respond to. Guard Bill Simmons began teaching Kramer increasingly advanced techniques over many weeks of patient instruction. How to cut individual cattle from a moving herd. How to throw a rope accurately from horseback while controlling your mount. How to handle a horse safely on rough terrain. By the summer of 1944, Kramer could ride skillfully enough that Simmons joked to his fellow guards, "I could hire him as a full-time ranch hand tomorrow if this war ever comes to an end." These intensive riding and roping sessions created genuine bonds that completely transcended the traditional prisoner-guard relationship. When an experienced cowboy teaches someone to rope or ride properly, there's a special intimacy involved in the process. You're sharing knowledge that has been carefully passed down through multiple generations, skills that define your cultural identity and entire way of life. The evenings spent around those improvised gathering spots, the long days working side by side in dusty cotton fields, the shared cigarettes and songs, all of it gradually accumulated into something neither the guards nor the prisoners had anticipated when the war began. Stories became the valuable currency of a remarkable transformation that fundamentally challenged everything both groups had been systematically taught about each other by their respective governments and military leaders. The propaganda that had painted Germans as inhuman monsters and Americans as barbaric gangsters slowly crumbled under the overwhelming weight of actual human connection and genuine friendship. The German prisoners gradually began sharing personal stories that revealed uncomfortable truths about their individual participation in this war. Many were career soldiers who had enlisted in the German military before Hitler ever came to power. But a substantial number had been conscripted against their will and personal preferences. A prisoner named Friedrich Schmidt told guards about receiving his official draft notice in 1941 when he was just 19 years old, working peacefully in his father's carpentry shop in a small village near Munich. He had possessed no interest in politics, no enthusiasm for Nazi ideology, no desire to fight anyone. He had simply been ordered to report for military service, and the alternative to immediate compliance was summary execution for desertion. Schmidt's story wasn't unique among the prisoners. Dozens shared similar accounts of forced military service, of families threatened if their sons didn't serve obediently, of the impossible position ordinary German citizens found themselves trapped in. The guards heard detailed descriptions of life under Nazi rule, from perspectives that completely contradicted the monolithic image of a unified German war machine marching in perfect lockstep. A prisoner named Otto Becker described how his family had quietly opposed the Nazi regime from the beginning, how his father had lost his teaching position for refusing to join the Nazi party, how neighbors disappeared in the night for saying the wrong thing to the wrong person. The Germany these prisoners described wasn't the goose-stepping, fanatically loyal society shown in American newsreels. It was a terrified nation where millions of people lived in constant fear, going through the motions of support because the consequences of dissent were deadly. The Texan guards reciprocated with their own honest stories that humanized Americans in the prisoners' eyes and revealed that the United States wasn't the wealthy paradise Nazi propaganda sometimes portrayed. They talked openly about the devastating Depression years of the 1930s, about families losing their farms and ranches to bank foreclosures, about the desperation that had defined rural communities for nearly a decade. Guard Sam Wheeler described watching his father's ranch get auctioned off in 1934, how his entire family had lived in a tent for 6 months afterward, how they had survived on government relief and whatever odd jobs they could find. These weren't stories of American superiority or easy prosperity. They were stories of struggle, genuine hardship and survival that the German prisoners could recognize immediately because they had experienced similar challenges in their own lives. The conversations eventually touched on the families both groups had left behind in their respective countries. The guards showed treasured photographs of wives, children, and aging parents back home. The prisoners shared carefully censored letters from Germany containing news of families coping with Allied bombing raids, severe food shortages, and the grinding uncertainty of seemingly endless war. One particularly powerful moment occurred in September 1944, when guard Robert Hayes learned that his younger brother had been killed in France during the Allied advance following the Normandy invasion. He sat outside the wire that evening, visibly shaken and trying to process his grief. Several German prisoners approached the fence to offer genuine condolences for his loss. The tragic irony wasn't lost on anyone involved. These German soldiers were expressing heartfelt sympathy for an American death that had been caused by German forces. But the grief was completely genuine and deeply felt. They understood exactly what Hayes was experiencing because they had lost brothers, close friends, and beloved comrades themselves. War had taken people they loved from both sides of the conflict. The guards gradually began recognizing that the vast majority of these prisoners weren't committed ideological Nazis at all. Yes, there were certainly some dedicated Nazi officers among the POW population who maintained strict party discipline and caused ongoing problems for camp administrators. Those true believers were typically isolated in separate compounds, away from the general prison population. But the majority of prisoners at facilities like Camp Hurn were ordinary soldiers, farm boys, shopkeepers, and factory workers who had found themselves on the wrong side of history through circumstance rather than personal conviction. Many privately expressed profound relief at having been captured, at being safely out of the war alive, and relatively unharmed. This recognition flowed both ways across the fence. The German prisoners realized that the Americans weren't the culturally bankrupt, money-obsessed caricatures that Nazi propaganda had portrayed for years. These Texas cowboys possessed deep spiritual connections to their land and ancient traditions. They had strong family values, rigid codes of honor about hard work and keeping your word. In many ways, their values closely resembled traditional German rural values that had been corrupted by Nazi ideology. The war in Europe officially ended on May 8, 1945, but the German prisoners housed in Texas facilities didn't immediately return home. Repatriation was a massive logistical undertaking that required careful planning and enormous resources. Many POWs remained in American camps until well into 1946, continuing their daily routines of work, recreation, and gradual cultural exchange. During those final months of captivity, something completely unexpected happened that surprised everyone involved. Many prisoners expressed that they didn't want to leave Texas. They had spent 2 or 3 years in relative comfort, had grown accustomed to regular meals and considerable freedom, and they genuinely feared what awaited them back in defeated Germany. The country lay in complete ruins, divided among occupying powers, with millions homeless and starving. Some prisoners actually asked guards directly if there was any legal way they could remain permanently in America. The bonds forged during those years of captivity didn't end when ships finally carried prisoners back across the Atlantic Ocean. Starting in late 1946 and continuing through the 1950s, letters began arriving at Texas addresses from former POWs who had returned to Germany. These weren't brief thank you notes or formal acknowledgments. They were detailed, heartfelt letters describing the devastating destruction prisoners found upon returning home, expressing genuine gratitude for their humane treatment in Texas, and often desperately asking for help. One former prisoner, Heinrich Weber, wrote to guard Tom Wilson in 1947, describing how his hometown of Dresden had been completely obliterated by Allied firebombing campaigns, how his surviving family members were living in a basement, how food was nearly impossible to obtain through any means. Wilson organized an impressive care package drive among local residents in Robertson County, and several families sent substantial parcels of food, clothing, and essential supplies to Weber's struggling family across the ocean. The correspondence flowed naturally in both directions. Guards wrote regularly to prisoners they had befriended, sometimes enclosing photographs of the camp, of horses the prisoners had learned to ride, of the fields where they had worked during their captivity. Guard Charlie Patterson maintained an active correspondence with Ernst Fröhlich, the German who had shown such remarkable talent for roping, for over 30 years after the war ended. Their letters covered everything from family news to advanced farming techniques to deep philosophical discussions about the war and its lasting aftermath. Patterson carefully kept every letter, and his daughter later donated the entire collection to the Texas Historical Commission, where they remain permanently archived as testimony to an unlikely friendship that transcended nationality and war. By the early 1950s, some former prisoners began making concrete plans to return to Texas, not as captives this time, but as hopeful immigrants seeking new lives in America. The McCarran-Walter Act of 1952 significantly eased immigration restrictions for Germans, and several former Camp Hurn POWs took full advantage of the opportunity. Joseph Kramer, the Bavarian farmhand who had learned to ride Western style so skillfully, immigrated to Texas in 1953. He found immediate employment as a ranch hand near Hurn, the same town where he had been imprisoned. Within 5 years of steady work and careful saving, he had accumulated enough money to purchase his own small ranch. In 1958, he married a local woman named Mary Ann Schultz, whose father had actually been one of the guards at the original camp. The wedding made headlines in the local newspaper. "Former POW marries guard's daughter," read the headline that captured the attention of readers across Texas. Kramer wasn't alone in choosing to make Texas his permanent home. At least a dozen former Camp Hurn prisoners eventually settled in Texas permanently, becoming naturalized American citizens, starting successful businesses, and raising families. Otto Fischer, the Hamburg clerk who had accepted that very first cigarette through the fence back in May 1943, opened a thriving bakery in Waco in 1955 that operated successfully for 43 years until his retirement. Karl Mueller, the baker's son from Stuttgart, who had been so moved by touching a horse's muzzle, became a highly successful rancher outside Bryan, specializing in breeding superior quarter horses using skills he had first learned as a prisoner of war. The most remarkable reunions occurred decades after the war had ended and been relegated to history books. In 1976, Camp Hurn organized a special reunion that brought together former guards and former prisoners from across the country and even from Europe. Over 200 people attended the emotional gathering, including 37 Germans who traveled specifically from Europe for the event. The local newspaper covered the reunion extensively, publishing moving photographs of elderly men embracing warmly, laughing together, sharing treasured memories of their time together during the war. One particularly striking image captured guard Bill Simmons, then 78 years old, patiently teaching Ernst Fröhlich's young grandson how to throw a lariat properly, passing down the exact same skills he had taught the boy's grandfather 32 years earlier. The story of German POWs in Texas and the cowboys who guarded them has gradually emerged from historical obscurity, though it remains completely unknown to most Americans even today. For decades after the war ended, the topic was rarely discussed publicly. Neither side had much incentive to publicize these experiences. Americans were focused on celebrating victory and moving forward with their lives. Germans were desperately trying to rebuild their shattered nation and come to terms with the Holocaust's unimaginable horrors. The idea that some German soldiers had enjoyed pleasant experiences in Texas seemed trivial or even inappropriate given the war's much larger context. But descendants of both the guards and the prisoners refused to let these remarkable stories die with their elders. In the 1980s, families began systematically donating letters, photographs, and personal items to local historical societies scattered across Texas. The Camp Hurn Preservation Society was established in 1982 initially by the children and grandchildren of former guards who had heard these stories their entire lives and wanted to preserve them for future generations. They purchased a significant portion of the original camp land and began serious archaeological work to identify building foundations and recover artifacts. What they discovered was truly remarkable. They found remains of the chapel the prisoners had constructed with their own hands. They uncovered remnants of the sports field where soccer matches had been played. They even located some of the original wooden posts from the barbed wire fencing that had once defined the boundaries between freedom and captivity. Museums across Texas now feature extensive exhibits dedicated to the POW camp experience and its lasting impact on local communities. The Texas Military Forces Museum in Austin maintains an entire section showing daily life at camps like Hurn. The displays include meticulously recreated barracks interiors, authentic mess hall setups, and impressive displays of original artwork created by prisoners during their captivity. The National Museum of the Pacific War in Fredericksburg includes substantial materials about the Texas camps in its broader World War II exhibits. These displays prominently feature the actual letters exchanged between guards and prisoners, photographs from the emotional 1976 reunion, and oral history recordings made with members of both groups during their final years. Historical markers now stand at many former campsites across the state. The Texas Historical Commission erected an official marker at Camp Hurn in 1985 that reads in part, "Here, German prisoners of war discovered that their captors could be generous enemies and that Americans, particularly Texans, judged men by character rather than uniform." Similar markers exist at the sites of former camps in Mexia, Huntsville, and Fort Bliss. These monuments acknowledge something profoundly important, that even in the midst of humanity's darkest impulses, individual people could still choose connection over hatred. The academic community has increasingly recognized the broad historical significance of the Texas POW experience. Historians like Arnold Kramer, whose 1979 book, Nazi Prisoners of War in America, remains the definitive academic work on the subject, documented how the treatment of German POWs in America stood in stark contrast to the systematic brutality occurring in Axis and Soviet camps. The survival rate for German POWs held in American custody exceeded 99%, a figure that is almost unprecedented in the history of modern warfare. Recent research conducted by the University of Texas has examined how the American camp experience influenced German attitudes toward democracy and American culture in the crucial post-war period, with compelling evidence suggesting that former POWs became some of West Germany's strongest advocates for Atlantic partnership during the tense Cold War years. Educational programs now bring this hidden history into Texas schools. Students in communities that once hosted camps research the topic for history projects, interview descendants of guards and prisoners, and visit the carefully preserved historical sites. Some schools have established ongoing pen pal programs with schools in Germany, connecting students across generations and continuing the cultural exchange that began around those impromptu campfire gatherings in 1943. The descendants of both groups have continued to meet regularly. The final major reunion occurred in 2005, exactly 60 years after the war's end. By then, nearly all the original guards and prisoners had passed away, but over 400 descendants attended the emotional gathering. They shared family stories passed down through generations, exchanged treasured old photographs, and marveled at how a handful of shared cigarettes and cowboy stories beside a fence had created bonds lasting across 3 full generations. What had begun as a simple moment of human decency between supposed enemies had evolved into something permanent and meaningful. It stands as a powerful reminder that even barbed wire and warfare cannot always contain our fundamental capacity to recognize the humanity in those we are taught to hate.